Hello and welcome back to a group of videos which hopefully will thrive and will turn into its whole little thing on the channel. We'll see how things go. So this is something I'm calling the kitchen table coder. This is episode 1, so this is the first proper episode of a series of videos I'm going to do about the Rust programming language, or more specifically me learning the Rust programming language. So if you want to know how to set up the environment, like the tool chain and all the other bits and bobs, then I did do an episode 0 for this. So this is the first week we'll be looking at code in any depth. I'm mapping the series loosely with the book, the Rust programming language, which, if you're interested, and this is a cool thing about this, if we bring up the internet, so this is actually on the Rust website, the official Rust website. They've got an HTML version of the book. I actually bought the paperback edition just because I wanted to add it to my coding book collection, and I also wanted to sort of support the writers of this. It's an awesome book. I love it. I'm 2 chapters in, so hopefully that'll still be a thing as I move through the book, but I really like the way this book is laid out. So in this week's episode we're going to be looking at the guessing game chapter. So if I just explain the sort of way these episodes are going to go and the idea behind this. So I don't know if I've mentioned in previous episodes, but I did have a parallel career in teaching when I was working for myself during the very late 90s into pretty much all of the 2000s. And I taught at what in North America they might call, I suppose, a community college. So I lectured at East Surrey College in the UK. And during that time I was teaching mainly information sciences, so about management information systems and information management to middle and senior managers. So it was more a strategic course, but in the course of lecturing there I did spend about a year, I think it was more than a term, doing web programming. So that was, things like HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and various other things that I had learnt previously. I think we touched on a little bit of active server pages and possibly PHP. I can't remember what the requirements for the course were because they were really strict. It was part of I think an HNC in programming or computer science. I'm not sure because I got involved as a result of, I think, another lecturer getting sick, so I sort of stepped in and took over that particular unit on the course. And one thing I used to do when I was teaching back then is, if I was teaching on a course, I'd spend the summer before the start of the course writing out like a course booklet for the students. So I'd create my own course booklet based on the concepts I was going to teach, but in abstraction, and then I'd riff around the ideas. I'm not going to be doing that for this particular set of videos. This is a different approach. So this is getting a bit meta. So this is me commenting on me trying to learn. So the idea is I'm going to be going through the booklet each week off camera, and trying to teach myself Rust using their template. And then I'll comment not so much on the book, because I'm pretty sure already just flicking through the book, I think this book's great. So it's nothing about the quality of the book, but it's more about, as I'm going through, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, what things come up in my head as, oh, I need to make a note of that, or I need to really pay attention and write that concept down, because later on I'm going to come across that in depth, and I'll need to really understand that. And it's interesting in this episode because they're doing what I really like in these programming books generally. I always like it when in the first or second chapter they run through a program and it introduces things that you haven't seen before. And, they make a point that, okay, we're going to explain this later in the book, but they do some explanation. In this one, it's quite a bit, actually. But also, they'll be saying things like, well, we're going to go into this in more detail and say chapter 9. So I'm going to do a similar thing here. When I start to wrestle with the concept or flag it up and say, look, this is a thing either I don't remember from another programming language or I've got no clue at all. Because I'm relying a little bit on obviously some previous knowledge. I'm not going into this with a beginner's mind as much as I would like to. I'm still trying to retain that inquisitiveness that I think I've said, I had when I was sitting at my grandparents' kitchen table teaching myself how to code, but without any books, I don't think. And so at that point, making notes in my head, I need to understand this concept a little bit better. When I get back to school, I need to ask a person or go to the library and get a book out. There was no internet to look this stuff up. There was no, Google searching or going on to, the various code helping sites, things like Stack Overflow. And again, with this, we're going to rely pretty much, I'm going to try and rely on the book, or the electronic equivalent here, which is the same as the book, which is really cool. They've put this on the website in totality, and it's up to you if you choose to purchase the book. I just bought it because I wanted to add it to my collection, and support the writers. So that's where I'm going with this. So often what I will have done is in the week leading up to the episode that I'm going to do, I will have devoured the chapter and made some notes, and that'll help me avoid me having to sort of type stuff live on video, which is always great fun when you've got like a book on the table in front of you, 2 screens and a pop filter. Anybody that has done this will know how awkward that can be, even if you've got the perfect setup. So I've done a number of quick things to help to speed that process up, so you're not watching me type for however long and making a mess of it because I'm sitting slightly awkwardly. So let's dive in. So we're going to be looking at this guessing game program that's in, is it chapter 2? And I'll just sort of comment on my own learning thoughts as we go through this, and hopefully, it's something you're going to benefit from. Let me know how I'm going to pretty much stick to that method because that's what's happening. I'm learning this as I go along, and I don't really want to spend time writing my own course materials or learning outcomes, all the wonderful things you do when you're lecturing that you have to do, like a course plan and various other stuff, all the support files. And I'm not going to map it back to any outcomes as such. I'm sure I could, but I don't really want to do that. That would destroy the fun at this point in time. So I have a sort of clean screen of Visual Studio Code open. I also have my versions of the code, which is essentially the book typed in. I wanted to type it in myself, so the experience of typing, I think, code helps the learning as well. I could have gone to the site and copy pasted the chunks out if I'd wanted to, but I decided not to do that. Of course, I can't say I'll always keep to that, but that's the plan as I'm going through each week off camera. So the first thing we need to do is we need to use Cargo. If you remember from the previous week, we're going to be using Cargo to create a new project. So we need to do that first. I deliberately didn't do that yet. And then what we'll do is once we've got the container up and running, or there with the folders, I'm going to simply copy the pre-prepared files in there. So you can see, let me just make sure I've spelt this right, because it's really important in terms of the Cargill Toml file, which we also had a look at. Yeah, I would strongly suggest, if you haven't seen episode 0, you do that. New guessing game, yep. Boom. Okay, there we have it. So we can now go CD. Guessing. Oops, don't forget the underscore there. Hang on, what did I do there? I did CCZ, didn't I? See, there you go. And it just proves what a terrible on-camera typist I am. And just to show you, so there's the folders. At the moment we've got the Cargill Toml file, we've got the source folder. There's no debug folder because we haven't compiled anything yet. So what we'll do is we'll go into here. So we're going to open this up, and just being careful we get the right one, because we've got several on here now. Because if you remember, in the source file they're all called main. Okay, there we have it. So there's our, so whenever you create a new one, you always get this hello world opens up. You noticed in there as well, if we go back a level, there's the Cargill Toml file. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. So there it is. And there's my main RS. So there's like the bare bones. In a moment I'm going to be substituting these out and I'll talk about them. But I just wanted to show you that. Now if you remember, just as a recap, if we wanted to run our program, if we just do cargo run, because we're in the similar FM folder, and we do this, it will correctly build to that, or correctly, sorry, it will run and build. So run will do a run and build. Build will do a build without running. And I'm going to talk about, there's some command line additions that you can add to this for when you do like a final release as well, that we'll talk about. So that's our starting point. Now what I'm going to do, I'll just close that while I copy these because I don't want to mess things up. Here's my code that I prepared earlier. So I'll just do this in Windows. I could do this in DOS, but why make things painful for myself? And go here. If you remember, I just created a user called Rust for convenience. You don't have to do that. I would create wherever you do choose to create in your own user folder. I would definitely create a projects folder, however, just to avoid you just creating a load of folders in that main user folder. Oh look, there's my guessing code. I'd already got it there, you see. Okay, so what did I pick up first of all? Oh, let's just drag that into the source, replace it, and then go back for the cargo folder, and then I'll show you as we go through this what the differences were. Okay, I don't think I need those open anymore, so we'll go back in and you'll notice there's quite a big difference. I've deliberately included a whole load of comments just for my own sanity. Hopefully you can see, and I'll highlight it as we go through, you'll see the main code stick out here, and it highlights quite conveniently when I click on it as well, which is quite nice. But this is just a reminder to myself, so I'm not constantly looking down on notes on my book, so it's on the screen. And then the other thing I'll do, because I do need to talk about it, is I will open the TOML file. Okay, so first thing you need to know is the comments and things I'm going to talk about. They mention a number of concepts which are going to be explained in later episodes. For example, two colons like this indicate an associated function. So it's usually like this form where you've got something and then followed by its associated function. So just pointing that out before we start. Is there are going to be some things here which I'll go through very superficially, but we will revisit them in later episodes as we get to the appropriate chapter in the book. So let's go through the first bit. You can see here, this is where our main is, but before we get to the main, for this particular code, there's going to be a number of things that we need to use which aren't in scope, for want of a better word, until we do that, we do something. So we've got 3 things we need to do before we get to the sort of main programming section. So if a type you want is not what they call in the prelude, so I think the prelude, and again I'll have to look this word up as hopefully it will come up again. So I think that's just the core, another way of saying that, the core part of the language. So it's not in the prelude. You'll need to use a command to bring that in. You need to use the use command. So here we've got use std : IO. So we're bringing the output library into scope because it's not in scope as part of that initial firing up of Rust, of the environment, that prelude. We'll also need to bring in a type of enumeration we're going to use later on in the program, which is ordering, an enumeration called ordering, and that allows us to compare 2 values with match as being less, greater or equal. So ordering, the enumerator contains this enumeration. So that is in the, you can see here we've got standard and then these appropriate sort of associated functions. Then we get an interesting one. So this one you'll see is something they're referring to as the RNG trait, brings that into scope. And that will use methods that we're going to need to generate a random number because this is a guessing game program. And because of the nature of this, we have to include it in the dependencies file in cargo TOML. It's not part of the standard library. So therefore, it's in here under dependencies. So this I added in here. And this is really cool because the nice thing here is if you're using a different version of this particular method, you can stipulate that so that whenever you build the program it'll always use the right version. Now what happens is when you put these in cargo.toml, the other thing to remember is when you do your first run or build or whatever to build a file, it will take a lot longer because it needs to pull this down from the web wherever that's stored. So just note when we go and build this a little bit later, you'll notice the first time it takes a little bit longer. So yeah, so that's all the bit before it. Then we've got this bit. So we have this function called main. And fn declares a new function. In this case, you'll notice the empty parenthesis to indicate there's no parameters going in. and the curly braces surround the whole section of the main body of the code below. So it's the function for main, and that's the first thing after these, these appropriate references to outside, resources, functions, traits, whatever. So you'll notice as well, the programming language uses curly brackets for blocks. So within that main block, we've got our first thing going on, which is Println, and it's actually a macro, and we can tell it's a macro because of this exclamation mark here. You can see there. And this is calling a macro rather than a function, and when we get into later episodes I'll go into more details about the difference between a macro and a function in this language, because again I'm literally learning as I go along. I mean, I know the difference between macro and functions in other languages and other scenarios, but it's interesting to see what that represents within this language. Then we get to call that that previous trait, if you like. So we have here just explanation of what's going on. So this piece of code, where are we? Here is our function. As particular random number generator, the corresponding genRange method takes numbers as arguments and generates a number. So in this method you have to be a bit careful, and anybody that's dealt with arrays or various other number reference systems using indexing really understand how the indexing works. And the same is a point here with this particular method. So with this particular method, there's an interesting thing going on. The first number is the lower bound on the random number generator, and that's inclusive. The upper bound for this particular method is exclusive. So when you look at this, the boundaries of the random number it's going to generate are between 1 and 100. Because the first one is inclusive, the last one is exclusive. So again, just make sure whenever you're using any function you really understand what the bounds are on anything, where bounds are involved. And it's using the let command. Interesting to see let here. It's funny, I hadn't seen a let command for a long while, since BASIC, until I dabbled, I think, in F# for a period of time. So it's interesting to see a let command. So here the let command is binding the value to an immutable variable named secret number. So again, we'll get an episode where we'll talk about the difference between immutable and mutable, and basically think of being able to change something. So immutable, we won't be able to change this, it's set. Mutable, we can change. So how it works in Rust is, by default, any variable is immutable by default. You'll see how you define a mutable variable in a moment, where you might need to change the contents of the variable. But again, I'm not going to go into massive details about the reasons why and why not you wouldn't use mutable or mutable. Already probably anybody that's coded will know some of that, or you'll be able to guess, if you haven't, why you might want to make something mutable or immutable. And we get a loop command. So if you're just using the raw loop in Rust, you basically set up this like eternal loop. So if you just do a loop, and that's all it is. There's the start of the loop, and then we've got the end down here. It's a nice thing with using a coding environment like this, you can really see where the brackets begin and end, which is nice. the other thing I've done in this, just to, because I was finding it a little bit annoying. If you remember, I did install a Rust helper, and it was starting to put in various support code that wasn't part of necessarily the Rust code, and I was finding it super annoying, so I actually switched it off. And I probably tend to do that a lot in these coding environments. I'll sometimes switch the helpers on and off as they either hinder me or help me. The advantage of having them on is they've got like their own version of autocomplete for the language, which you do get a little bit of it with it switched off, but it's not so precise. What I did find is there were other coding and grammatical helpers which I found were a little bit intrusive, so I've actually switched them off for this episode. With loop, if we didn't do anything, it would just loop indefinitely, but you'll see in a moment there's various ways we can break out of the loop. So think about what we need in this guessing game program. So we're going to need our user to input a guess here. So again, we've got another Println command just to say, please input our guess. The one up here that we put out was just basically to tell the user exactly what the program's about. That's what that one up there. Here we are sort of prompting for some input. So before we do that, we need to define a variable that's going to take our input. So we're going to create a mutable variable because we want to be able to change it when the person inputs it, and then subsequently change it again when they input other guesses. And we're going to bound that to a new empty instance of a string. And you can see here we've got, let, in this case, mutable. We're going to call it guess equal this instance of a new string. And again, you can see we've got the colons here, indicating, as I think we set up here, that we have this associated function thing going on here. So moving down here, we're going to use the input output library, which is why we had to include that in the sort of top of the code. We're going to call the standard in function, and then in turn call the readLine method to get an input from our user. It takes guess as an argument. That's where the input value will be placed. The variable needs to be mutable, so the method can change its contents to the input value. Even though we defined it as mutable, it would appear we need to restate that here. This ampersand indicates the argument is a reference, and I'm interested finding out later on about how referencing is handled in the language and anything like that, because anybody that's coded C or anything like that, I think from what I remember, it's been a while, that with symbols like this, it sends shivers up your spine because you're going down the route of pointers, I think, and various other things, if my memory serves me correctly. So I'm going to be interested in hear what the implications here are with references, but we won't talk in too much detail. But I just wanted to flag that up if you wonder why we've got this here in addition to the mutable. So the second part of the method handles any potential failure and has been placed on a separate line for clarity. It could all be on on the same line. So you can see here that we have a thing where if it does fail for whatever reason in the inputs, it just puts up failed to read the line as a warning there. And that's an important thing when you're programming, is how you deal with errors. We would want to put something in here that deals with failures, for input failures. And again, it's something we'll no doubt cover in later episodes, but just so you know, that's why that's there. And it could be on the same line. You'll also notice actually something I didn't point out. In this language, can you see all the lines are ended with a semicolon? And as you learn the language, you'll get to discover exactly where you do need to put those, in terms of, if you've got a block of code and you've put it over subsequent lines, where you put that semicolon. So then we've got a section after that. So one thing you need to bear in mind, and anybody that's programmed before in certain languages may know this already, when you're inputting stuff from a line prompt or whatever you want to call it, often certain languages will bring it in as a certain type. And in the case here, it's going to bring it in as a string. Anyway, I think regardless of what we defined here, we just defined that because we would define that because we've taken on a string. But the problem is certain languages, when you input it, even if it's a number, it still treats that raw item as a string. So we have to bear that in mind, and the following section code does a number of things, because we need to take the guess, which is a string, and convert it to a number so it can be compared with the value from the random number generator. As far as I know, I didn't try it, we couldn't cheat. We couldn't go, oh, let's just define this as like a U32, which I'll explain in a minute, an unsigned 32-bit, which is what we need for the comparison, because that's what the for the random number comparison, because we've got a number. Why don't we just do that? Well, I think if we did, and then we got to this line, we'd get failures every time when we put stuff in, because we're trying to stick a character, whatever you want to call it, string, into something that isn't a string. So we couldn't cheat and define this variable as like some numerical, using an instance of an unsigned 32-bit number. So what we have to do is we have to take our value and convert it to something that's going to work when we come to compare our guess with our random number that the program's generated. And the good thing is, though, even though the variable guess binds to a string, Rust will allow us to shadow, and again we'll learn a bit more about shadowing later on, no doubt, the previous value of guess with a new one of a different type. So we can do that. So we can shadow. And will pass the string guess to an unsigned 32-bit number, and the match expression helps us handle any non-number guesses. You see the two arms of the enumeration here, so we're also using an enumeration as part of our match. And OK returns a number, and an error continues to the next loop. So what happens here is if we attempt to do this trim to remove, so we're going to be removing any white space and U-line characters from our original value, and we're going to pass that and convert it to an unsigned 32-bit number, and we're going to put it into the shadow version of guess. But if things go wonky, so if it goes okay, then yep, we're going to do that. It will return the number, and the pass will happen. If it doesn't and something goes wrong, it'll just continue, which means that what it'll do is it'll continue to the next loop, not to the next line. So it won't break out of this and do nothing. It'll continue to the next loop, which means it just asks us for another guess, which is exactly what we want. If the guess for whatever reason at this point has made no sense, it's not going to work. We're not going to be able to pass it through to an unsigned 32-bit number, then boom, it asks us again. And it just reminds us what we guessed. We could take this out, but it just echoes back what we've guessed. This is what this does. It's just another print command. Now you see here a useful thing. We're using placeholders in Println now. So this is our placeholder, and how it works is, well, I think, and again I need to go in this. So at the moment it's fairly simple. This variable, this, you know, the variable guess is going to be placed here. So just say you guessed and then the value. Now we get to the actual comparison bit. So this is really the engine of everything, I suppose. So the CMP method compares two values, and in combination with the ordering type enumeration, which we sort of preloaded at the start of the program, and the match expression, it's going to result in certain arms being run down here. And you can see here, this is our code block after this, and these are our arms. One of the arms itself has another block as well within it. And you'll notice as well, whenever I'm indenting here, these programs make it easy for you, but this is actually putting in 4 spaces. On here it's set that tab is 4 spaces. So if you're using like a coding environment that doesn't do that, you do. My understanding is that 4 spaces is the convention, not just tab or anything else. But it just so happens that in Visual Studio Code, the way I've got it set up by default is that if I use the tab key, it does put the 4 spaces in for me instead of just using a tab. And I know that because I loaded this up in Notepad and double checked as well. So yeah, so here we have our secret number here, which was guessed way, you know, created way back here, because of course it's not going to create a new one every time we loop through. It's outside of the loop. So I'm assuming as well at some time in the book they'll start to talk about global and local variables as well. Maybe that's something that springs to mind as soon as I see something outside of a loop. Yeah, so how that works, but again, something we need to save for a later episode. So we've got 2 values. Yeah, I've already said that. So yeah, so fairly straightforward. So it compares guess. So we have a method on guess, and the argument it takes is the number you're trying to compare against guess. So in this case, a secret number. So it matches it, and it says, is it less than the secret number? In which case it's too small. It prints out that. Then this ordering enumerator is looking to see, is it greater than that? If it is, then we're going to execute this. And of course what's happening here, this bit here could be whatever code we like. As you can see here, we've got a block. So if it's equal, we want to do a couple of things. We need to print the line you win, and then completely break out of the loop altogether. So we just want to break the loop. We don't want to repeat the loop. We don't want to continue it. We want to break out of it. So here, the continue and the break are the ways in which we are navigating this infinite loop, which would be infinite if we didn't have this. So the 2 ways you affect the loop is, 1, if there's an error on the on this conversion that's going on here, this pass, in which case it just continues the loop, the next loop of the iteration, or this one, which just completely breaks the loop, and that breaks it out altogether, which ultimately, after the loop, the next thing is the end of the program. And as I pointed out, notice how the curly braces line up with the start of the block of code they're ending. Also conveniently, you get these nice lines showing you the code blocks as well. In Rust, the indent is 4 spaces. When building for release, so that's if you're building a final release, you can use cargo build with this release argument, and that way it optimizes the code. It takes longer, and it will create another folder the first time it runs. I think it's called, actually just called release or build or something. We'll try it in a moment, see what happens. So you use just the cargo build command during stages before final release build. And also, one other thing, there's a tool in here called Rust FMT, which can be used to format code. I'm not going to use it, I don't need to, but just if you're curious, there's a formatting tool which is pretty handy. So let's do something here. Let's try and run this. So hopefully I haven't made a massive mess up. Now if you remember, if you do cargo run, it's going to run and build, or sorry, run and build and run the project. So this takes a lot longer than usual because there's a number of things going on here. One, it needs to fetch down over here our random command, because this is outside of the standard libraries. So that's why it's taking so long. If I subsequently, if I then choose to, oh, we've got a spurious network error. That's not good. Okay, so welcome back. I'm going to try and tag this on the end of the video. So we're back in business. Basically, I just swapped dongles on here. Much better. So I think I'm going to need to get a new USB dongle for this. It looks like my one that was there has been in the wall. So you can see now that this is what's supposed to happen. Okay, so now if I was to build that again, let me just show you. Just so you can see how once it's done that, once it's done one build where it's got hold of those additional libraries that it needs from the web, if you do a subsequent build, then it's a lot faster. So that's the only thing you'll notice. And that's primarily what I wanted to show you, what happens. So we could have done, now that it's working, of course, if I do cargo run, it's going to build and run it, and you can see here's the program again. So I guess 10 too small, so we will go for again, let's do that, too small. Okay, so now somewhere between the two, so that would be 85. Oh, this is interesting. So between 85 and 100. Right. So a difference between 15 and 100. So we need to add 7 onto that, don't we, to get there. 92, too big. Okay. So half of that from 85. So let's try 85 plus 3. Let's try 88 then. Too big. 87. Too big. There we go. So yeah, that basically is, well, you saw already what the program's supposed to do, but so it's funny how, network problems, this is the only downside with, I'm sure anybody that's had systems where they have to pull libraries from the web as they need them, has probably experienced this sort of thing before. We're getting this weird error. Clearly, I ran it a few more times after I went off camera, and it was occurring at different points. So that did point me to a possible problem with the Wi-Fi. So I was going to go upstairs and reboot the router, but I decided no, I'd simply swap Wi-Fi dongles over And I was also a bit concerned because the download speed seemed slow for what it was, and as soon as I swapped the dongle over, it was much better. I'm not sure what's wrong with the bad one. Yeah, it's funny, the good one looks in a really worse state because it looks like the cat's chewed it a little bit, used it to sharpen its teeth. But yeah, so that's the finished program. Now the other thing I think I wanted to mention is this command. So if we look at the guessing game folder, let's get that so I don't get muddled up. So our final sort of target, our debug target, is this. So this is our finished program. And if we were to cd into this directory, I'm pointing at the screen but you can't see me, it's funny. Yeah, if we go into this, run it, we get the same as we just run here, so I won't need to do that. But what I wanted to show you is, what if I use this other command here? What's the difference? So you remember I said it takes a little bit longer. There's some optimizations going on there, or so I'm told. But now, and I'm not going to bother running it, you can see, look, we now have some extra stuff here. So we've now got a release menu here. And you can see, look, the exe is a lot smaller. But again, the great thing with this is now fully compiled, so I can take this file and move it across to any other, Windows-based system that has that I can run this on, and it will run completely standalone. So yeah, so there we go. So got to the bottom of the mystery. It was a network issue, and hopefully that wasn't too disruptive. What I will do is I will tack this on the back, if I can, of the existing video,